morning of the graduation arrived quietly, the kind of quiet that settles deep into a man's bones when he has lived a life of early mornings and late nights. Daniel Carter woke before his alarm, as he always did, staring at the cracked ceiling of his small apartment. For a moment, he forgot what day it was. Then it came rushing back to him, heavy and fragile at the same time. Ethan was graduating today. Daniel sat up slowly, rubbing his hands together, palms rough and scarred from years of work no one ever noticed. He moved quietly through the apartment, careful not to wake the neighbors through the thin walls. The place was small but clean, spotless in a way only a janitor's home could be. Every surface wiped, every corner swept, as if cleanliness were his silent language to the world. He opened Ethan's bedroom door and paused. The room was empty now. His son had left early to meet his classmates. The bed was neatly made, the graduation gown hanging over the chair like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Daniel stood there longer than he meant to, his chest tightening as memories flooded back. Years of packing lunches, tying shoelaces, sitting alone at parent-teacher meetings, working double shifts so Ethan would never feel the absence of his mother more than he already did. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Ethan's graduation schedule. He had read it so many times the creases were worn thin. He smiled faintly, then carefully tucked it back, as if it were something sacred. By the time Daniel arrived at the school, the hallways were buzzing with excitement. Parents in pressed suits and elegant dresses moved in groups, laughing, posing for photos, their pride loud and visible. Daniel walked past them quietly, eyes down, adjusting the collar of his work shirt. He hadn't gone home to change. There hadn't been time, and truthfully, he didn't want to draw attention. He was used to blending into the background. He took a seat near the back of the auditorium, choosing a spot where he wouldn't block anyone's view. From there, he could see the stage clearly. Rows of graduates filled the front, all wearing identical gowns, faces glowing with youth and anticipation. Daniel scanned the crowd until he found Ethan. His son looked taller than he remembered. Broader somehow. Ethan sat up straight, hands resting on his knees, trying to appear calm. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. This was the boy he used to carry on his shoulders. The boy who once fell asleep on his chest while Daniel studied for night classes he never finished. Ethan glanced into the audience, his eyes searching instinctively. For a second, Daniel worried he might not see him. Then their eyes met. Ethan's expression softened, just for a moment, and his lips curved into a small smile meant only for his father. Daniel nodded back, a silent conversation passing between them. "I'm here. I see you. I always have." The lights dimmed slightly as the ceremony began. Names were announced, speeches followed, applause came in waves. Daniel listened carefully, absorbing every word as if it all mattered deeply, because to him, it did. He wasn't thinking about his aching feet or the long shift that still awaited him tomorrow. All that existed was this moment. Then the announcer introduced the keynote speaker. A.U.S. Navy Captain. Daniel barely reacted. The military was a chapter of his life he rarely opened anymore. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, unaware that fate had already begun to stir. The captain stepped into view, tall and composed, medals reflecting the stage lights. His presence commanded attention. As he made his way down the aisle, he acknowledged the audience with polite nods. His eyes scanned the crowd out of habit, a discipline drilled into him long ago. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a glimpse. A familiar shape on a forearm. The captain slowed his pace, his heart beginning to pound. He told himself it was nothing. Just coincidence. But his eyes refused to move away. A faded tattoo, worn by time, scarred by life. The captain stopped walking. The symbol was unmistakable, a unit insignia burned into his memory by fire, loss, and survival. A unit that no longer officially existed. A unit that had been written off as casualties 2 decades earlier. His breath caught. His mouth went dry. Daniel noticed the sudden pause and looked up, confused. The captain's eyes locked onto his arm, where the sleeve of his shirt had ridden up slightly. Daniel instinctively pulled it down, a reflex he had learned years ago. Some things were not meant to be seen. But it was too late. The captain turned fully toward him and walked closer, each step heavy with disbelief. Whispers rippled through the audience. Teachers shifted in their seats. The ceremony stalled, suspended in confusion. The captain stopped in front of Daniel. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the captain's voice broke the silence, low and unsteady. He asked where Daniel had gotten the tattoo. Daniel hesitated, his jaw tightened. He hadn't spoken about his service in years. It felt like reopening a wound that had finally learned how to stay quiet. He answered simply, "From his unit, back when he served." The color drained from the captain's face. His eyes filled with tears he did not bother to hide. He whispered words that made Daniel's breath stop. Words about a rescue, about a man who dragged him from wreckage under fire, about a soldier who disappeared before medals could be given, before names could be cleared. Daniel looked away. He had never thought of himself as anything special. He had survived, others had not. That was the truth he lived with. The captain straightened, his body moving on instinct older than thought. He stood at attention and raised his hand in a salute meant for heroes. The auditorium fell completely silent. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, unsure of what to do. His heart hammered in his chest. He hadn't wanted this. He had come only to watch his son graduate. The captain's salute trembled. Then he stepped forward and embraced Daniel, holding him tightly, as if afraid he might vanish again. Gasps echoed. Some parents wiped their eyes. Students whispered in awe. From the front row, Ethan watched, his mind struggling to understand what he was seeing. His father, the quiet man who scrubbed floors and emptied trash, being saluted by a Navy captain, being honored in front of everyone. Tears blurred Ethan's vision. In that moment, everything he thought he knew about his father shifted. Daniel pulled back slightly, his voice barely audible as he said he had only done his job. The captain shook his head, tears streaming freely now, and said that sometimes, doing your job meant saving a life at the cost of your own recognition. The ceremony eventually resumed, but nothing felt the same after that. When Ethan's name was finally called, he walked toward the stage with a new weight in his chest. Pride, gratitude, awe. As he accepted his diploma, he looked out into the audience again. This time, he didn't look for his father at the back. He looked for him standing tall. And Daniel Carter, the janitor, the single father, the forgotten soldier, stood there quietly, eyes shining, no longer invisible. After Ethan stepped down from the stage, diploma clutched tightly in his hands, the applause felt different to him. Louder, warmer, heavier with meaning. His legs trembled as he returned to his seat, but it wasn't fear. It was the sudden realization that the man who had raised him was someone he had never fully known. A man who carried entire lifetimes inside his silence. Daniel remained standing for a few moments longer than necessary, unsure where to put his hands, unsure where to look. Attention was something he had spent decades avoiding. He slowly sat back down, his heart still racing, his mind drifting backward through years he rarely allowed himself to remember. The captain returned to the stage, visibly changed. His prepared speech lay forgotten on the podium. When he finally spoke, his voice no longer carried the polished tone of ceremony. It carried truth. He spoke about courage that never makes headlines. About men who return home without parades, without medals, without anyone knowing what they gave up so others could live full lives. He spoke about sacrifice that doesn't end on the battlefield, but follows a person home, into ordinary jobs, into quiet apartments, into sleepless nights. Daniel listened, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. As the captain spoke, Daniel's memories pulled him under. He remembered the heat, the noise, the chaos of that night long ago. A mission gone wrong, flames licking the edges of vision, shouting over gunfire. He remembered seeing the captain pinned under wreckage, blood mixing with dust, eyes wide but still alive. Daniel hadn't thought, he never did in moments like that. He had moved, lifted, dragged, covered, then vanished into smoke as reinforcements arrived. No name, no report, just survival. When Daniel came home months later, he came back to a world that had moved on without him. The military chapter closed quietly. Then life hit harder than any battlefield ever had. His wife's illness, hospital rooms, the slow goodbye that stretched over years, her hand growing weaker in his. The promise he made to raise Ethan right, no matter what it cost. That promise became his mission. He took whatever work he could. Cleaning offices at night, mopping school hallways before dawn, learning to cook, to braid hair, to sit through school plays where every other seat was filled by two parents. He learned to smile through exhaustion, to swallow pride, to become invisible if it meant his son could feel normal. Ethan never knew the full story. Daniel never wanted him to. He wanted his son to see him only as a dad, not as a man shaped by loss and war. When the ceremony finally ended, families rushed forward, laughter and congratulations filling the air. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, then turned and walked straight toward his father. They met halfway down the aisle. For a second, neither spoke. Then Ethan hugged him, tighter than he ever had before. "I didn't know," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. Daniel rested his chin lightly on his son's shoulder. "You didn't need to." They pulled apart, and Ethan looked at his father with new eyes. The lines on Daniel's face. The scars he had never questioned. The tired hands that had held his entire world together. Around them, people stared with a mix of curiosity and respect. Some nodded, some wiped tears. The captain approached again, slower this time, more gently. He congratulated Ethan, his voice full of warmth, and then turned back to Daniel. He asked where life had taken him after the service. Daniel answered honestly, about work, about loss, about raising his son alone. The captain listened quietly, then placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. He told him that sometimes the strongest men are the ones history forgets. But forgetting does not erase their worth. Before leaving, the captain promised something Daniel had never expected. Not medals, not ceremonies, just recognition. His name would be restored where it belonged. Not for glory, but for truth. Daniel nodded, unsure how to respond. As they walked out of the auditorium together, Ethan noticed something strange. His father's posture had changed. Not dramatically, just slightly, as if a weight he had carried for years had shifted, even if it had not fully lifted. Outside, sunlight washed over them. Families posed for photos, parents laughed loudly. Daniel stood awkwardly at first, until Ethan handed his phone to a stranger and asked for a picture. Father and son stood side by side. When the photo was taken, Daniel didn't try to step out of frame. For the first time, he stayed. That evening, back in their apartment, Ethan placed his diploma carefully on the table. Daniel cooked dinner like he always did, simple and quiet. But the air between them had changed. Words hung unspoken, heavy but not uncomfortable. After they ate, Ethan finally asked the question that had been burning in him all day. Why Daniel had never told him. Daniel took a long breath. He explained that some stories are meant to protect the people we love, not impress them. He said he wanted Ethan to grow up free, not living under the shadow of things that could never be undone. Ethan listened silently, then nodded. He understood more than Daniel realized. Later that night, as Daniel lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling again. But this time, his chest felt lighter. The past had found him, not to punish him, but to acknowledge him. And in the next room, Ethan lay awake too, realizing that the man he called Dad was more than a janitor, more than a survivor. He was a quiet hero. The days after the graduation passed in a way Daniel had never experienced before. Normally, life moved in a predictable rhythm for him. Wake up before sunrise, work quietly, come home tired, repeat. But now, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. People at the school began looking at him differently. Teachers who had passed him for years with polite indifference now stopped to greet him. Some thanked him, others simply smiled with a kind of respect that made Daniel uncomfortable but also strangely warm. He didn't tell anyone the full story. He never corrected rumors or added details. When asked, he simply nodded and returned to his work. Floors still needed cleaning, trash still needed emptying. Life, in many ways, remained the same. But inside, Daniel felt the echo of something long buried finally being heard. Ethan, on the other hand, changed in ways Daniel noticed immediately. He stood taller. He spoke with more confidence. When friends asked about his father, Ethan no longer shrugged or avoided the topic. He spoke simply, proudly. Not exaggerating, not boasting, just telling the truth. One afternoon, Ethan came home with an envelope addressed to Daniel. The return seal bore an official emblem. Daniel stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a letter acknowledging his service, confirming his unit's actions, restoring records that had been lost or sealed away. There were no grand promises, no dramatic language. Just recognition, quiet, respectful, real. Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same drawer where he kept Ethan's childhood drawings and old report cards. That night, Daniel finally told Ethan more about his past. Not the violence, not the pain, just the moments of brotherhood, the sense of purpose, the responsibility he had felt to bring others home alive. Ethan listened closely, absorbing every word, realizing that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, enduring quietly for years. Weeks later, the Navy captain visited again. This time, not for a ceremony. Just a conversation. He sat at Daniel's small kitchen table, coffee cups between them, medals replaced by plain clothes. Two men, no ranks, no audience. The captain thanked Daniel again, not as an officer, but as a man who owed his life to another. He spoke about how that night had followed him for years, how he had carried guilt for the ones who didn't come back, and how seeing Daniel alive had finally closed a wound he never thought would heal. Daniel listened, understanding more than he said. Some pain didn't need words. Before leaving, the captain shook Daniel's hand firmly and told him something Daniel would never forget. That the measure of a man was not in what the world called him, but in what he carried without complaint. Life slowly returned to normal. Ethan prepared for college. Daniel continued working. There were no parades, no headlines, and Daniel didn't want them. But something fundamental had changed. He no longer saw himself as invisible. On Ethan's first day leaving for college, Daniel stood at the bus station, hands in his pockets, heart heavy and full all at once. He hugged his son tightly, longer than usual. "Be kind," Daniel said quietly. "Work hard, and remember who you are." Ethan nodded, his eyes shining. "I know who I come from," he replied. As the bus pulled away, Daniel stood there watching until it disappeared from sight. He felt loneliness, yes, but also peace. He had done his job. Not just as a soldier, not just as a janitor, but as a father. That evening, Daniel returned to his apartment, cooked a simple meal, and sat alone at the table. The silence was different now. Not empty, earned. He looked at his hands, scarred and worn, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled. Some heroes are remembered in books. Some are honored in speeches. And some quietly raise their children, clean the world around them, and carry their sacrifices without ever asking to be seen. Daniel Carter was one of them. And now, finally, the world had seen him.